I hold in my hand a New Testament. It will substitute for the whole thing tonight because bringing down the Hebrew version was just a little heavier. So what do you think you're looking at when you're looking at a New Testament?
Collection of 27 books.
A collection of books, right?
Different authors.
Different authors.
Written 2,000 years ago.
So in history, a book from history, or a collection of books. They're not all books though.
No, letters.
Letters, Gospels as a genre, Revelation as a distinctive type of apocalyptic literature.
13 books done by Paul.
That is our next, we're doing that in next time round, the authorship of Paul's letters. So we'll get into that in detail. It depends how you count. But that is yes, but it depends which ones you count. So we'll get to that topic a bit next time. But yes, Paul is one of the authors. Now, question. For the purpose of interpretation, does it make any difference if Paul is the author of the letter to the Romans rather than Matthew being the author of the letter to the Romans?
Yes, it does.
Yes and no.
All right, so we'll start with yes, it does, because
Because he says he's from Paul, and if he's not from Paul, then there's question marks over it. And there's
all right, let's use the Gospel of Luke, where he doesn't say that he's Luke. Does it matter if it's Luke who writes it or Matthew who writes it?
not to us, we
Not
did
so
say.
much, no.
Not so much, because
Because it stands in its own right, you know. You can evaluate it for what it is.
one of
But
the
it's anonymous too. He's not claiming to be someone else.
yes. It's likely that in the first century that the first recipients of the gospel would have known who was writing it. So even though it's unknown to us, it doesn't necessarily make it anonymous. But the question of who wrote it and why they wrote it. Matthew is a distinctive gospel from Luke, possibly because Matthew is written to Christians coming out of a particularly Jewish context, and Luke is writing to possibly Christians coming out of a non-Jewish context, a Gentile context. And probably, and this is the bit that biblical criticism is interested in, possibly knowing the different contexts will give you a different sense of the meaning of what you're reading and how you interpret it. Whereas, if you start with the idea that the Bible is just the Bible, and it has no prehistory, then you, in effect, don't take any account of the difference between who wrote it, when it was written, who was receiving the information, and the culture in which it's written. Now, there are a number of Christians who are quite happy not paying attention to who and what. I grew up with the Thomas Chain Reference Bible. We go back to that. Thomas Chain Reference Bible. So you would have your Bible text, and then next to it there would be a chain reference. And you could get from one text that says something about love to the next one as if it's a continuous chain. Not paying attention to the fact that as you follow the chain, you jumped authors and context because it went with a fairly flat understanding of the Bible, and so it really didn't matter which verse you pulled it out of or which verses provided the context for that. It was, in some way, it lacked context, and it didn't matter if it was coming out of Matthew or Luke. It was just the Bible. It didn't matter if it was coming out of Isaiah or Matthew. It was the Bible. And so you had a kind of fairly flat sense of what the Bible was. And so instead of saying there are 27 texts in the New Testament, you would just say there was one Bible and one author of the Bible, being God. And it really doesn't matter if it was Luke, Matthew, Peter, or Paul, or Isaiah, or Ezekiel who was writing. Somehow the inspiration ignored them and just came out truth. It was in some ways, and I offer this tentatively, but not without some reflection. In some ways, it was more like a Islamic understanding of the Quran than it was a Christian understanding of the Bible. To the extent that I understand Islam, the Quran is understood to be written in heaven, in Arabic, in the script, and what Muhammad received from the angel Gabriel was a recitation of it. So the angel read to him from the heavenly book, and Muhammad was only writing it down. And so the book, the Quran, has no context because it's heavenly. It has no history because it's heavenly. It has no human context or author because it's heavenly. And part of the stress that Simon what's his the satanic verses. Got in Salman Russ, yes, whatever. Part of the trouble he got into was he talked about some verses that there's a dispute within the Islamic community over whether or not they belong in the Quran or not. And the satanic verses were, according to one reading of the story, were slipped in by Satan and didn't actually belong to the original Quran. But this idea that the Quran isn't exactly like it is in heaven is blasphemous, it's scandalous. Whereas Christians, by and large, in terms of the biblical scholarship, is very much conscious of the biblical prehistory and its human context and origins, and takes that into account in reading and engaging with it. So one of the things I'm trying to do when I'm teaching New Testament is to try and get them away from a sense of the Bible as a promise box. Again, going back to my youth, you could buy a box and verses of the Bible were written on a small piece of paper and rolled up and then put in the box, and you took kind of tweezers and stuck it in, and you pulled it out, and there was your promise verse for the day. Nothing about context or framework or who wrote it or something. It was a kind of divine word that lacks context and culture and time. And one of the things that biblical criticism is about is trying to get back to that sense of the prehistory of the Bible, but its context, its time, and its place, and trying to understand it. So in my understanding of my framework, the question of biblical criticism comes at it from two directions. One is in terms of interpretation. You will understand, I think, Paul's letter to the Romans better if you know who Paul is and if you know about the church in Rome, and that you have some understanding of the context in which it was written. I think that will lead to better interpretation. And if it leads to better interpretation, then hopefully to better application and living it out. So there's that side of it. And there's a second side to it in terms of apologetics. On what basis do you understand the Bible to be communicating to you? What is the reliability of the information in it? And how are you, on what basis does it act as a source of revelation or authority to you? So those two questions I think are slightly different. And if I had to opt for one over the other, I would always pick interpretation over apologetics. The purpose of the scriptures, I think, is so that you might be equipped for every good work. The point of reading it is so that you might become more godly. The point of reading it is so that you might be changed into or conformed to the image of God's Son. And if you're not getting that out of it, then you're mishandling the text. But that doesn't mean you can't also engage in questions about its context and reliability and stuff like that. All right, so this has got rough notes, just so that you don't have to try and memorize everything I'm saying. This will just, you can use it as a memory prompt later. It does have one of my favorite cartoons. Now listen up, guys. I don't want to end up with 4 different versions of this Jesus Sermon on the Mount. And one of the things I think that biblical criticism notices is that we do end up with multiple descriptions of what Jesus said and has to account and engage with that. But I think that's just something that is the reality of it. I've also got in there, does your church obey Jesus' commands? And of course, assuming that some of you are going to decent churches, the answer would be yes. I'm a Baptist, so the answer is probably well. But there is, in America, because you can find everything in America, there is in America a group of Baptists called foot washing Baptists, because they take seriously what Jesus says in John 13, that so if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. And these foot washing Baptists do that.
The Pope does too, doesn't it?
Pardon?
The Pope does too.
Yeah, once a year. But foot washing Baptists take it much more seriously.
I've had my feet washed by one of those Baptists.
All right, have you? And would it be a strange experience?
It was a bit strange.
Yeah.
Typical weird sort of political term.
Yeah. That's a story to be had at the break when people are having their tea. We tend to understand that to be in its context and to be speaking to a particular cultural context, and we look to understand it in its time and look for an application in our time of serving one another, not lording it over the other and stuff. We look for an understanding of it, because again we're looking at it, the Bible, as a historical document that belongs to a time and place, and not a timeless, culturalist, languageless reality. It always strikes me as interesting or useful or helpful to realize that when Muslims talk about the Quran, they're only talking about the Arabic version of it. Because once you translate it, it's not the Quran anymore. Because now it's just a translation of the Quran. But as the Quran, because the Quran is the copy of what's in heaven, and what's in heaven is in Arabic. But Christians, down through the ages, have never felt stressed about calling their translated scriptures the Word of God. Because it's not the preciseness of the language that it was originally written in, whether that be Greek or Hebrew, Aramaic. I tried to learn all three of those, let me say, not successfully. It's not the preciseness of the language, it's the truth of what's said. And so, while it is useful, and it can be helpful in some ways, to engage with the scriptures in Greek or in Hebrew, we don't tell our people that if you're not reading it in the original languages, you're not hearing from God. Because that's not our understanding of how God communicates, that God communicates to us in our language in a way that we understand. And so that sense of it should be translated, it should be conveyed in a way that people understand, is inherent in the idea of a God who comes into the world as a human. It's part of the incarnation, that God doesn't stay in heaven and lobs over the edge of heaven a holy book. He actually engages primarily in Jesus, but prior to Jesus, in the history of Israel and then in the history of the church. God is at work in our world to speak and to communicate with us. So it shouldn't surprise us that the Bible is historically conditioned, and it comes in a language of its time, and it uses the idioms and the understanding of its time to communicate. And it calls us to wash one another's feet, because that was the type of servitude that people who thought they were important would come away from. And we're called to serve one another without thinking of ourselves as better than someone else. If Jesus could serve as a servant, then why don't we? And you can do that without foot washing. And you could wash one another's feet and still walk away thinking that you're better than everybody else. It's not the act, it's the obedience or the recognition of who we are in front of Christ that's important. All right, so that's just a kind of, this is why we approach the Bible as having prehistory, as having a context, and that's why we engage in biblical criticism. Now, the term biblical criticism is partly the result of translating from German. And again, I've tried to learn German. I've tried to learn lots of languages without great success. But German was a language I found confusing on some... Anybody speak German? Germans have a habit of just sticking words together and making new words. And so even when you've got a dictionary in front of you, it can be really hard to find what happens when you stick all the words together and come up with it. But the Germans just have a branch of biblical studies called Formgeschichte, which is history of forms. But when we translate that word Formgeschichte into English, we call it form criticism. So the Germans, and who kind of lead this branch of biblical studies, they're talking about the history of forms, and now we've called it form criticism. And the same with Redaction Geschichte, history of redaction or history of editing. Again, we've taken the German Geschichte, history, and turned it into criticism. And so when we use the word criticism in biblical studies, we're not thinking in terms of being critical or being negative, of passing judgment on. We're thinking of it in that German sense of analyzing from a historical framework, or using the tools of history to engage with the question of the form of the sayings of Jesus, or the way in which the gospel writers edited their gospels. So biblical criticism doesn't mean being critical of the Bible. It means using historical tools to analyze a text that is indeed a historical text. And so biblical critics, those engaged in biblical criticism, actually see themselves as a sub-discipline of history. And so a New Testament scholar is most often using and engaging with the tools of history and historians and archaeologists and stuff than they are in just systematic theology, doctrines. It's a different field to it. And so biblical criticism is about using the tools of history in order to engage with the text. So if with that as the framework introduction, we'll talk about some of the types of criticism, starting at what they call lower criticism, moving to higher criticism. Lower criticism being used because it's at the foundational level of the text, moving up to the issues about authorship and stuff, which is higher above it. It's not low is good, high is bad, or vice versa. It's just a way of framing the order in which you approach the question. So the first type of biblical criticism is called textual criticism. And almost everybody will recall at some point looking at a Bible and having a little footnote that says other versions read something. That is the work of a textual critic. They've actually looked at all the other versions and they have deemed that there is a difference in this particular verse that you, the reader, might be interested in being aware of. Now, there are a whole lot more differences than you know in your English version. This is, like I say, the Greek New Testament, and the top is the Greek version of the New Testament. But this section is called the critical apparatus. And so in verse 9, here there's a note that suggests that there are different ways, that the different versions of this, of John's Gospel have different things at that point. And so there's a whole list of them, and there's a whole range of things from scraps of papyri to actual larger editions. They also look at when an early Christian writer has written in Latin, and they say, what Greek must that he have been looking at in order to get from there to the Latin? And so they're looking at all the things to try and work out what is the actual form of the text. Now, the one that I was just pointing out there was rated by the editors as A. A means this is almost certainly the right reading that's in the text. There's B, there's C, and there's D. And there's and I've got another book upstairs in which there's a commentary of the critical discussion
What's the name of that book?
of
What you've got in the
this is the New Testament, so this is just a Greek New Testament,
Yeah.
and
Is that the Allen version?
this is actually the UBS.
Newer than the Atlantic version. It's newer than.
Yes, this is the UBS one, but because textual criticism has been working at this for so long, and there's so much agreement, the Nestle Aland German version and the United Bible Society version, they actually co-publish the text. Now, the two versions will give you different apparatus details, but they go with the same text because there is so little disagreement on what the actual text is. While we don't have the original version of John's Gospel, we can be very confident that what we have is pretty much what was available in the first century of John's Gospel. There are one or two places where it can be disputed, but none of them, and seriously, none of them make any real difference to interpretation. There is not a doctrine in the Christian tradition or a ethical practice that is undone by a textual dispute. Textual criticism is a very well-established form of criticism of study. And the only ones, no, I'm sure that's an exaggeration, but the only ones that really dispute it are the people still using King James Version. The King James Version was written in 1611. Since 1611, there have been thousands of versions of New Testament writings found, a lot of them in the desert of Egypt where they were preserved, but all over the place, lots and lots of texts. And so what we have now is the pretty much assured conclusion of scholarship as to the faithful text. An example of where it might differ is in 1 John 5, 7 and 8. And in the King James Version, you'll read, "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one." Doctrine of the Trinity, established 1 John 5, 7. "And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree in one." The English Standard Version, which is a conservative, modern edition of the New Testament, reads in 1 John 5, 7, 8, "For there are three that testify, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree." So what happened to the Father, Son, and Spirit? Well, the Father, Son, and Spirit, that line, that these three are one, actually first appears in Latin before it ever appears in a Greek version of 1 John. It doesn't appear until after the Trinitarian disputes of the 4th century. We know that because if that verse was in 1 John, they would have been arguing about its meaning, but nobody is arguing about its meaning because nobody has it in their version of 1 John. So we can be certain that the King James is using a manuscript that had it in it, but that doesn't go back all the way to the 1st century when 1 John was written. So you have two choices. You keep it because you like it, and you say that God has preserved it in the King James Bible, and that all the other Bibles are heretics. Or you say that the science of biblical criticism has established that that verse isn't part of 1 John, and then you just get on with the business of interpreting what 1 John does, what 1 John means. So do you take the results of scholarship that is not based on people who are anti-Trinity, but just people who are using the tools of scholarship and accept the conclusion that that particular verse has been inserted by a copier? Because remember, they're not using photocopy machines, right? So they're copying by hand. So if a scribe who's copying by hand writes in this line, the scribe that comes after them won't know it's been written in. They'll just copy it. And then the next scribe will copy it. So you can actually work backwards to find the first time it turns up, because prior to that, all the scribes that are using different earlier versions will not copy it. But because of the way the manuscripts were found, the one that the King James used had it in it, even though it doesn't go all the way back to the 1st century. So that's what the textual criticism is looking at. There are a few other big, worthy of discussion kind of passages, but none of them really make any difference. And the scholars of all types, all colours, all theological persuasions are pretty much agreed on what we've got now in your modern versions of the Bible. Your English translations come from a really solid, established text. So textual criticism is the bottom of the foundational rung of the ladder. Next up is source criticism. So where did the people writing get their information from? Now, with Paul's letters, you don't have to worry too much about source criticism, because Paul wrote them. There are a few places where people wonder if Paul is quoting from some source. The Philippian hymn. Is Paul using a hymn from the early church, or did he compose it? And so that's a kind of source criticism kind of question. But more importantly, in the Old Testament, where you've got the Pentateuch, which is your first five books of the Old Testament, which spans a lot of years. Where did all that information come from, and how was it put together? Source criticism explores that. For New Testament people, the big discussion is around the Gospels. So at the moment, the basic conclusion is that Mark wrote the first Gospel, and that Matthew used Mark and a source that was available to Luke called Q, because it's German, Quell, source. So that Matthew had Mark, Q, and his own material, and that he used that. And that Luke had Mark, Q, and his own material. And John was writing a bit later when the three Gospels were out, and he was giving a fuller, more spiritual version of the account. So the sources are important. Sources are important for interpretation because it gives you a sense of what the different authors are doing with the material. But it's also important because when we're trying to get to the what Jesus said, you actually the Gospels aren't one source. If Mark tells us that Jesus was interested in the poor, and Luke's particular material tells us that Jesus was interested, and the Q material, the Matthew, Luke shared double tradition, tells us, then now we've got three sources that are telling us that Jesus was concerned for the poor. So, even though the Gospels can be considered a single story, there are multiple sources, and so in terms of historical reliability, you have more evidence for the reliability of that tradition. And they also distinguish between stories that come in miracle accounts, stories that come in parables, stories that come in sayings. These are all sources of the Jesus story, even though the Gospels look to us like a solid unit. There are multiple sources that come together, and an historian would consider that highly reliable because of multiple sources agreeing rather than just a single source for something. So if the only person that said Jesus was interested in the poor was Mark, then you would have historical doubts. But the fact that Lucan's special material, Matthean material, parables, miracle stories all point to the same thing, build up historical reliability. So source criticism is used in terms of interpretation, but it's also used in terms of apologetics for building up the sense of the evidence that we have around Jesus. We're pretty sure. Well, we can be pretty. I've been on a study tour to Israel, and I've been on the mountain where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, and you know it's the Sermon on the Mount because there's a big church built there, and they wouldn't have built the church if it wasn't true. So you can be pretty sure that Jesus taught his disciples. However, Matthew has put a lot of material together and grouped them. Matthew likes to create blocks of teaching text. And the Sermon on the Mount is a block of teaching text that is spread out in Luke because Luke isn't bringing them all together. It's more likely that Matthew has brought them together than that Luke has separated them. Just because of the way they use the sources they have. But Matthew tells us that Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and Luke tells us that Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor and woe to the rich." So you have a different take on that. Does the fact that we've got different sources telling us something slightly different mean that it's not reliable? Or does it tell us that in terms of what Jesus was saying, there are multiple levels of information that he talks about? So Jesus is interested in the humble and the meek, as well as he's interested in the care for the poor and the judgment on the rich. So just because they don't line up doesn't mean that they're not both contributing to our understanding of who Jesus is and what he calls us to do. I don't think you should try getting to the pearly gates, which is not really a biblical image, but I'm using it anyway. You don't want to get to the pearly gates and say, "Oh, I didn't worry about the poor, because I'm pretty sure that when Matthew said it was only about the humble, that I didn't have to worry about what Luke was saying." On the other hand, you don't get to the pearly gates and do it the other way around. These are both reliable indicators of the gospel of Jesus, even if they come from different sources, and because they come from different sources, carry a different sense to them. But source criticism is useful historically in terms of building up a bigger picture, but it has got its downside. And its downside, of course, is all in the Old Testament, where I don't spend a whole lot of time. But the Pentateuch is divided into 4 sources. And if you follow, it's fallen out of fashion now. But once upon a time, you could find the 4 sources in a particular verse and it had been stitched together. Very unlikely that anything is written like that, and particularly in a pre-literate society. Modern people have 4 things in front of them and cut and paste from them. Ancients didn't do that. Ancients worked more orally than visually with written stuff. It's fallen out of favour, And like a lot of things in biblical criticism, you can go over the top with it. But just because some people can go over the top doesn't mean that the underlying thing, that there are sources that are being drawn on, is reliable. But by and large, source criticism doesn't really lead to any interpretive gains. I mean, there's not a whole lot of focus on it. The next level is form criticism. Between when Jesus spoke things and when it got into written version in the Gospels, there's a period called 1611-2. Again, the Germans, because there's a biblical criticism. 1611-1 is Jesus. 1611-3 is the written Gospels, and in between 1611-2. 1611 means setting in life. So the setting in life of Jesus is Jesus in Judea in the year 30. The Gospels, the written versions that we've got, so you put Luke in the mid-60s. So that's 1611-3, Luke's church in the 60s. In between, how did the information get from 1 to 3? Form criticism says that the church repeated the words of Jesus or told stories about Jesus for particular liturgical purposes. So use in church services. And that the form that they used shaped the content of it. So certain sayings have a particular form to them. And that form actually can change the meaning or change the intent of it. And so the Germans who were form critics, Rudolf Bultmann in particular, were looking for the form and then using some rules derived from folk literature to work backwards to get to the original sayings of Jesus. So,
Give an example of a form.
a miracle story is one form. So there are different kinds of miracle stories. So healing stories are told in a particular way. So you've got the illness, you've got Jesus doing something, you've got the outcome of it. It's a form. And because stories are told in a particular way. And so because it's got a form, the next time somebody tells a healing story of Jesus, they tend to follow that pattern.
Also like disputes with the Pharisees.
Yes, and that would be a form, and so the sayings of Jesus would be cast in this conflict situation where you start off with an antagonist saying this and Jesus acts it, and so there's a rhythm or routine to it. And so what they would do is try and break down that to get back to something behind it, working on the assumption that the early church would shape or add meaning to the sayings of Jesus. And so you had to get back to the original. Form criticism fell into disrepute because all the forms were made up. You can't find anywhere where there are rules about these kind of forms. Things have a natural form, but the fact that they had a particular form didn't actually work on the terms of looking at a particular saying of Jesus and saying, well, this started in this way and then the form has changed it. This is all based on how non-literate cultures pass on information. And that science, or branch of science, anthropology, was really big in the 30s, 40s, 50s, or whatever. And they were trying to make all these rules that people followed. But with time, it became less convincing. And so form criticism has fallen out of favor in biblical criticism. And there were no particular interpretive gains for it. it was important if people were not wanting to work with the final form of the gospel and look for an historical kernel. But by and large, the church is interested in the final form, and arguing over the kernels wasn't worth the effort.
Form criticism was seen as an antagonistic way.
Yes, because it was German, and the English North American church never and seminaries never really embraced it too much. But Bultmann is the classic form critic. But if you listen to one of his sermons, he's got an evangelical heart in the way he preaches. So I think perhaps the non-German speaking scholarship's been a little harsh on him. But his intent was probably better than his scholarship at that point. But you can read all this stuff in the history of the Synoptic Gospel tradition if you want to read all about that. Form criticism, one of the things that form criticism does badly is explain how the Gospels come to be. It explains how there's little bits and pockets, but how do they come together? Well, that was the next stage, next rung up the ladder. You go to redaction criticism. So instead of seeing the gospel writers as just collecting these forms, you go to redaction criticism, the editor. And so Luke is seen as an editor who takes this piece of information or this tradition and shapes it. And so in Luke's gospel, you find a lot more about Jesus' concern for the poor than you do in Matthew's. And that's seen as being Luke's particular emphasis. And so he selected material from all the material available to him, and he's given it a particular emphasis in a particular way. And so you can quite often pick a story, a gospel story just randomly, and you'll recognize that it comes from Luke. You'll recognize it as Matthew, Mark, or John, because they each have a kind of distinctive kind of way of putting it. So redaction criticism is kind of useful. And so, you put the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew next to the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, and you can see a different emphasis. That's really useful. But redaction criticism spends all its time looking at where the differences are when the majority of the Gospels are actually similar. So instead of looking at all that Luke says, it only looks at Luke as he's different from Matthew or Mark or John. And so you end up only with part of what Luke is saying. You find his emphasis, but you don't see the whole story. So redaction criticism gave way to narrative criticism. So instead of just seeing, form criticism sees Luke as a collector, redaction criticism sees him as an editor just placing it. Narrative criticism sees him as a storyteller. Now we see that Luke is telling a story with a beginning, a middle, an end, with a plot that develops with characters, with a particular emphasis, that in form criticism, source criticism, if you've got two accounts that are kind of the similar, you say, oh, there's two different sources. In narrative criticism, you say, oh, there's an emphasis. He's told the story here, now he's telling a similar story here, therefore he must be trying to get your attention. Because the Gospels are heard, and so repetition is an important part of the storytelling. And so now, instead of it being evidence that somehow somebody sneaked in a bit of the story that Luke didn't have, or it's a different source, it's just seen as, well, this is Luke's way of telling a story. He's putting two stories next to each other to give it meaning. So if you just take a story out of a gospel and turn it into a pericope, just a little passage, That's a little bit more form criticism. You're looking at just the story. But with narrative criticism, you want to know what went before, and you want to know what came after, so you get a sense of where does it fit in the story. In Luke's Gospel, one of the questions you ask is, does it come after 951? 951, Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem. And that passage, from there on, there's a focus on discipleship as following the one who has set his face to Jerusalem. And there's passages before that have a slightly different emphasis and context. So knowing where it fits in the story is part of knowing how to interpret something. The parables that come just before Jesus is arrested, Palm Sunday kind of stuff, because they come at a lens point of the story, gain weight. Because here they're carrying more of the story than if they were just 3 chapters earlier. It kind of matters where it fits into the story. So narrative criticism is asking questions about the plot. So narrative criticism has built up quite a following, and if it's in terms of Luke's Gospel, if you read Joel Green's commentary for the New International Commentaries New Testament series, he's a narrative critic, and so he's constantly saying, now that this character is brings in the earlier part of the story and how it kind of all flows together. So it's got a lot of interpretive gain to it. Historical criticism, exegetical criticism is not uses all these different tools in order to get into what the text meant at the time. And so historical, grammatical, exegetical criticism is trying to ask, what did Luke mean when he said that? What did Paul mean when he said that? And that's a dominant means of biblical studies in the evangelical church. Bock, his commentaries on Luke, which are massive, 2 volumes. Luke is this big, his 2 commentaries are that big. He's a historical, grammatical, exegetical critic. Lots of details. What does this word mean? Where would it come from? And he puts it all together to try and find the meaning of what's being said. In doing that, he's looking at a lot of trees, and sometimes I think he misses the forest, where Joel Green is looking at the forest with his narrative criticism kind of approach. I'm particularly interested in my PhD is in social science, and so even with narrative criticism, you tell stories. They have a social context. Characters have a social context, and if you don't know what that is, I think you're open to misreading, mishearing what the story is about. So take the classic example of the parable of the prodigal son. You don't understand that parable if you don't know what the father should have done when the son came and asked for his money. If you think it's just like when you wanted a loan from your dad to set yourself up or whatever, what you're doing is taking your 20th century, 21st century experience and transposing it back to the 1st century. But what should a 1st century father have done? Well, he should have slapped him down, because the family unit had to keep its wealth together. And not just the family unit. There was probably only one wealthy family in the village. And the younger son took 1/3 of that and wasted it somewhere else. And so the economy of the local region fell because the father didn't act like a father should. And so the father is actually a pathetic figure. He doesn't act like a real father. He's pathetic in terms of letting emotion take control instead of being in charge of it. And one of the suggestions is that when the father runs to embrace the son, it's to ensure that the villagers don't already take their revenge on the son because of destroying the wealth of the village. All this stuff comes from a kind of trying to get the social context and not reading our social context into that. So narrative criticism is important, but if you don't know the social cultural stuff, you won't read the story quite as it's intended. And the last one I've got on there is rhetorical criticism, and I must say that's one I don't do so well with because it's based on trying to understand the first century framework for creating literature. So, like letters follow a particular format, and they all have Greek and Latin names to them. And the trouble with rhetorical criticism is that what they're trying to do is find out how the author has tweaked the forms, but they can't agree on quite exactly what the forms, what order it's meant to go in. Gets a little complicated. But what they are, the usefulness of rhetorical criticism is that it comes, the point of the text is to move people. And the question is, how did first century people get moved? So in order that we hear that. And I would say, as a kind of concluding bit for this part of the evening, that is what I'm looking for when I study the New Testament. I'm looking for the rhetorical impact. What did Luke's telling of the story of Jesus in this particular way, what did Paul telling the Romans to do or think in his letter, what was the effect that those writers were trying to have on the people of God? And so if I can understand what Luke was trying to do, if I can understand what Paul was trying to do, if I can understand what John was trying to do when he tells the story of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, if I can hear the rhetorical intent, what the purpose of it, what the reader was meant to hear, not just know, but actually do out of it, then I know how I can respond as one of God's people to God's word. And so the goal is not just to break the New Testament or the Old Testament up into different things to study, but to use what we know of the context of the Bible and its writings so that we might have a better sense of what the writers were saying to the people of God, so that I, in turn, might hear that word spoken to me. And when I'm teaching exegesis, just if the student only tells me what Luke said for his church and doesn't tell me what I meant to do in response to that, I think they've only got part of the way of the task. The Bible is given to us so that we might be formed into God's people. And so all of these criticisms or these historical tools are meant to help us hear how we might be formed as God's people. So that's my overview of a topic that you can spend a lifetime in. For those who want to go further, this book by Stephen Neal and M.T. Wright, Tom Wright, is, I think, a readable description of the history of New Testament scholarship. It will take you through all the waves of criticism, their context, what was their strengths and what was their weaknesses associated with it. I think quite a readable 1861 to 1986. Who hasn't wondered what has happened in those 120 years of New Testament scholarship. It shapes who we are today. That's worth reading. And if you're interested in how this stuff actually gets to the interpretive stage, this is Robert Stein's Studying the Synoptic Gospels, and he talks about source criticism, he talks about font criticism and redaction criticism, and tries to show you what the interpretive value of that is. This is written at the college seminary kind of level, so it's used by students as they learn how to read and exegete the gospel. So it's more of a workbook. But if you're interested in that kind of thing, and you've not yet been to or committed to attending Intro to New Testament and exegetical subjects, this might give you a shortcut to that. So with that done, I think it's time for a break. And I'm happy to chat if you've got questions, and then we're going to circle up, and then you can ask and comment and critique all you like.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. I'll just kick off with the first question. Is there anything to kind of to fear or be guard against with in the world of biblical criticism? Like you get people like Bart Ehrman who are out to kind of undermine evangelicals. So what have you got to say about that?
By and large, tools are kind of neutral. And so the tool itself is not the problem. It's the epistemology or the philosophy or the theology behind the use of it. So by and large, I think you should more identify the person who's using biblical criticism than the actual biblical criticism method itself.
Yeah.
It is true that biblical criticism comes from a time of the Enlightenment and modernism, and there's a skepticism about spiritual things, and many of the critics were unsympathetic to miracles or to spiritual things. And so one of the things that they were doing was trying to de-spiritualize the story. But the de-spiritualizing of the story is in some ways not really what the tools are about. Used properly, the tool should be telling you what Luke thought happened, not what you think happened that Luke is talking about. And so the critics who use it to say that Jesus didn't do miracles, didn't do exorcisms and stuff like that, are looking for an alternate way of explaining exorcisms and miracles and stuff. But they'd have to agree that Luke thought Jesus did miracles, that the people at the time thought Jesus did miracles. Now the critic might decide that there were no miracles happening, but that's not part of biblical criticism. Biblical criticism answers the question, what did Luke think? What did the people around Jesus think? And that Jesus was a miracle worker, that Jesus was an exorcist, is kind of like built into multiple strands of the story. And so again, the source critics would be saying, well, it's coming from all these different places. It's not like Luke made it up. Because if it's only in Luke, only material, you might say, well, Luke made it up. But when it's in Matthew and Mark and less in John, but when you start doing that, biblical criticism works for the text rather than necessarily against it. So I think it's where, I think if we talk about Bart Ehrman, I think where that comes in is if Christians don't think of the Bible as a historical document, then when they hear that there are different sources, that there are different textual traditions with different readings and stuff, that can unsettle them. But I think what's being unsettled is a particular way of looking at the Bible rather than the truth of the Bible itself.
But that implies that the way they look at the Bible is not quite right.
Quite right. Yes and no, in the sense that what is really important is that we're shaped by the text. And so if somebody doesn't quite get who Paul is and why 1 Thessalonians is different from Galatians, or Galatians is different from Romans, yes, I don't think they're getting the rich fullness of the text. But I don't think that means that they don't get enough of the text to meet with God and to know God and stuff like that. But I think it's enhanced if they've got the more. It's like moving from a black and white TV to a real colour one, or from standard def to high def. I still can't see the difference between the standard def and high def, but my son tells me it's significant.
Well, I appreciated your address this evening, and I can see that a lot of those different types of criticism can be of value, and not that they always are, but they can be. You can get stuff from all those things. But one of the forms of criticism, one of the types of criticism that appealed least to me, that I feel more critical of, is this form criticism. Because this attempt to get back behind what is written to what happened originally, or what Jesus really said, and then it got all modified until we've got this. Yeah. It just sounds completely conjectural, for one thing, without any evidence for it. And it's got a kind of very, I kind of think that can very much be destructive, because it ends up, you reduce everything to next to nothing. That's how often seems to happen in my view.
In answering this question, do you want to refer to the Jesus I am statements that we were talking about before?
Well, there are 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. And it is felt that by some that you can answer the question of did Jesus think he was God by referring to before Abraham was I am. That's difficult to do historically because Matthew, Mark and Luke don't know that Jesus spoke like that. For John, it's a very distinctive way of Jesus speaking. And historically, the more that Jesus is revealed as the one who comes, God coming to visit his people, he ends up on the cross fairly quickly at that point. And so if Jesus was as explicit as John says he was, it doesn't seem to fit the gospel story as we know it. And so John is seen as bringing out the spiritual intent of Jesus, or the deeper meaning. And this is in modern biblical criticism. In the 2nd century, they knew that John told a very different gospel story than Matthew, Mark and Luke. And so John is, the symbol for John in the church is the eagle, because the eagle can fly into the sun without going blind. And John was seen as the one that could see that, whereas Luke is the bull. Anyway, but John is seen as having that kind of spiritual insight kind of thing. In terms of form criticism, they were making it up but they were making up based on what anthropologists were finding out when you go to villages and hear how they tell stories. And so how stories take a form and they're repeated. And so, and they looked at folk tales in Europe, so like Sleeping Beauty and all those kind of folk tales and stuff like that. And they were looking for the rules of folklore. But, as I said, that was never really established to the point where you could use it in the way that they were doing it. And so it has fallen into disrepute. There are, in the Old Testament, there's still some form critics, because there's you're dealing with a different kind of material. But in New Testament studies, it's given way to social memory theory. So the question is no longer other forms that carry it, but how do people remember stories, and how do communities remember stories? And so how much of a story is remembered and retold with the community thinking that's still the same story. So they're doing those kind of studies. But that really is taking the place of form criticism. The gap between Jesus' words and the written gospel, there's something going on there. Form criticism's answer was probably not a good answer to that. But social memory theory, I think, is starting to fill in that gap.
It seems to me there's a lot of assumptions in that, and a lot of conjecture. And the things you've mentioned about how these anthropologists look at it may not be valid, because the Jewish people have always been the people of the book, and even in Jesus' day, education, particularly for men, but education generally, was highly valued even for people who were poor. And so, their synagogue services were always to do with reading a section of scripture, and that was the heart of every synagogue service. And people who are from those kind of societies that have less of a literate background can remember things very well, and they get very skilled at memorising things and passing things on. There's a lot of assumptions about how things would get garbled. People give the impression of Chinese whispers, for example. And say, well, this is how it all happened, and you trace it back, through several retellings of the story, and you get something completely different. It's all just assumptions and conjecture.
Mostly, I certainly want to agree with most of it, but some of the stuff that you were using isn't as historically established.
Like what?
In terms of what we know about the synagogue services. And one of the things that we do know is that they used targums, because the scriptures are written in Hebrew, but the people spoke Aramaic. Mm-hmm. And so you have a kind of oral translation from the Hebrew to the Aramaic, which is a little expansive. And so the targums indicate...
Sorry, what is a targum?
It's an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew. We have written versions of some of the targums, but it was possibly oral, but certainly it got to be written and stuff. So the actual... what we do know in terms of social memory theory and stuff is that in a literate society, we consider memorizing something different from an oral society. And so an oral society is likely to consider an 80% retelling of a story to be accurate because it's orally heard. You don't have a text in front of you. When you go to a church and they start reading the Bible, people bring out their text and look at it, and you could tell if the person's gone off. But in the first century, most of the congregation is illiterate, and they certainly don't own copies of the text. So they're not. So what's considered accurate is a different level. Does the Apostle Paul have access to versions of the Old Testament that we don't have? Because he quotes it wrongly from ours. But part of what social memory critics are saying is that the way that people use the text in the oral culture is that Paul would read the text, and then he would go to his desk, whether he was writing it or dictating it to a secretary, and then he would work it from memory. And so the variation that you get between what Paul says is in the text and what the text that we have, the versions of the Hebrew text and stuff that we have, or the Greek text that we have, is probably within oral variation of it, because that's the way in which they use text. Now, yes, that's speculative, but it's based on a fairly... we know a lot about how people wrote in the first century and how people read in the first century. And some of the stuff about how Jews and synagogues work is part of a reading back to the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus, what became the kind of culture of the 2nd century, 3rd century synagogues. When the temple got destroyed in 70, Israel moved from a temple-based religion to a Torah text-based religion. And that was a fairly major shift, and probably reflected a shift in the synagogues as well. So that's not to say that your points aren't valid. It's to say there's just nuanced. And this kind of stuff is highly debated in New Testament studies, and nobody gets away with saying something just like they make up. Because as soon as you do, people are starting to go through all the targums and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very highly contested space. There are a lot of professional New Testament scholars in the world. And I haven't met anyone that isn't opinionated in that area. So it's fairly combative. So there's a kind of iron against iron kind of thing. And yeah, there's a general consensus, but that consensus moves as people get challenged and stuff. And that's why prompt criticism starts to fall away, because it can't sustain itself against the challenge. And then something else will come up.
It's even how we look at Scripture. We can hear about the rapture, right? We can say this is doctrine, this is truth, but not all people, not all religions within Christianity would believe the rapture. So there's different interpretations of truth or half-truth creeping in or brought into. We see something here, and this looks like, I'm just giving an example, like the rapture, and we can bring a whole doctrine here on very small part of something. You know? And this has crept into Christianity a lot widespread, but it's not widely accepted.
That it's crept in, or that the doctrine is...
Well, the doctrine is. We're taking a small part of what is an understanding or what someone put forward, and the Jesuits 100 odd years ago, I forget the name of the person, actually come up and he, brought up this. He actually preached like on the rapture theory, and before that it wasn't actually noted, it wasn't recognised. But today it's widespread, a whole different doctrine within the doctrine or philosophy.
Yes. So doctrines also are arise. I mean, the rapture and stuff popular in the mid 1800s. The Adventists, Seventh-day Baptists, and there were a lot of people. My mum used the Schofield Reference Bible that had this kind of stuff in it. Some of that was by reading a kind of flat Bible, so you're reading Revelation, you're juxtaposing it with 1 Thessalonians, you've got a verse in Matthew, and you try and link them together. Whereas if nowadays, what you're more likely to try and keep those apart and take them on their own merit first. And so in Matthew, where the two people in the field and one taken, in Matthew, that's more likely the one who is taken to judgment, and the one who remains escapes judgment. But because of the rapture being taken away as a good thing, the Matthew passage got reread as evidence of the rapture, when Matthew was probably framing it differently. And if you go back and try and read Matthew as Matthew, before you read Thessalonians or before you read Revelation, you end up with a different take. Thessalonians, the reference to the Parousia is more likely a reference to the Roman emperor tradition, where the people of the town, the key people of the town, would go out and meet the emperor and come home with the emperor. So it's not that they're taken away for a period of time. It's that they go to meet him, and so they come with the emperor, and the significance of the emperor is kind of shared with them, and they're honoured as being part of that. And so again, you've not got a kind of dispensationalist rapture, tribulation stuff. But so the more the more the texts are taken as, first of all, Paul talking to the Thessalonians, what would they have heard as a Roman town? How would they hear the word Parousia? The more you do that, the less likely you are to want to join it to 1 John or to Revelation. 1 John talks about antichrists with the S on the end, plural. Revelation doesn't talk about the antichrist. But by linking across, and then you've got the man of lawlessness, and by making links, but those links tend to happen on a flat Bible rather than a differentiated text. And it certainly in my practice, or the discipline of New Testament studies, the goal is to try and get the historical context first, and then put it together for a kind of consistent doctrine. But
it's quite a revelation to me, because I do tend to actually go across Gospels. So if you say looking at the feeding of the 5,000, there's 4 accounts of it. And so I kind of go across it. But you're saying you should actually go through the book.
yes,
To get the sense of it.
In the 2nd century, they developed.
Diatessaron.
There we go. I can't even say that word. But that's the 4 texts written into one, because it was an embarrassment to them that they would have 4 versions of things. So they turned it into one, and the church said, "We don't want that," because while it is maybe apologetically easier to sell one version of the story than 4, the richness of the 4 can't be lost to the church. And so I would ask, what is Luke's emphasis first, or what is Matthew's, what is John's, Mark, and what is Mark, rather than trying to push past them to get to a single verse behind it. Because even if there were 5,000 people being fed that day, there were probably 5,000 versions of the story, because everybody remembers, experiences the story from their own. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that we've got 4 versions. I think it's actually a good thing. And if we let each one tell us their story, we're richer for. And at Easter and Christmas, it's better to let, Christmas is simpler, Luke and Matthew tell you their stories rather than trying to mix them together and come up with like the historical version. Well, if Luke is telling us about the shepherds, he's doing that for a reason. And if Matthew's telling us about the Magi, he's doing that for a reason. And given that Matthew is a Jewish gospel, and the first people to recognize it are astrologers from another land, and Matthew's gospel ends with going to all the world to make disciples. So even though Matthew is the Jewish gospel, it's framed by the Gentiles coming to worship and being invited to worship. I think that's significant to read if we stick to Matthew, whereas if we flatten it, you lose that Matthean emphasis that you would otherwise pick up. That's not just... So biblical theology now, by and large, if you pick up a textbook on biblical theology, you'll get a chapter on Matthew, a chapter on Luke, a chapter on John and stuff. What maybe you don't always get, but what you should get then is a bringing that together, into the grand story. And that's one of the things that you see in New Testament study or biblical studies, is the grand narrative, the meta-narrative, the story that runs from Genesis through to Revelation. And certainly not a story that gets to Genesis 3 and then skips all the way to Jesus on the cross. There's the story of Israel in there as well, and the gospel stories of Jesus. It's not just humans sinned and Jesus died for their sins. Stories are a lot bigger, a lot richer than that. And so there's a lot of work on that. And I particularly like Chris Wright on the kind of meta-narrative story of the Bible. But that's another topic. Yeah.
All right.
So,
Yes.
It's a bit hard to express, but I've been spending a bit of time looking into the original language, which I believe was Hebrew for the New Testament. There was a lot of anti-Semitism and all the copies have been destroyed except Matthew. There were several copies of Hebrew Matthew around the place, but the sort of religious people, for want of a better word, were Hebrew speakers, and normally anything to do with the Word of God, which was of course in Hebrew in the Old Testament, was amongst people who were working in Hebrew, and Hebrew seems to be God's original language and so on. Okay, well then translated to Aramaic, where there are good copies of the Aramaic which go way back, and it does appear they tried very hard to keep it away from Catholic influence. The Pope was very strong at various times, wanted to push anti-Semitism and controlling text, and similarly the Orthodox churches. Anyway, kept way out in the eastern part of the of the world, which was sort of Syria and Iraq and so on. Anyway, the point being, and then probably from Aramaic into Greek, and all the way around there's going to be translation errors, as there is translating into English. And the point is mainly that in the 4th century, Constantine was such a powerful influence, and he was only really a half-baked Christian at best. He spent a lot of money on churches and things, but he had some terrible attitudes, and even at the end of his life he was saying, issuing coins, celebrating Sol Invictus, which is the sun god and so on. So he was, a pagan type Christian, if you like, and that he was so anti-Semitic that they got rid of all the, the Jewish terminology. Yeshua is the name rather than Jesus. Jesus is a Greek type name, and so even the Greek copies that we've got date from the 4th century, which were heavily influenced by Constantine, who really became head of the church at that stage, became political sort of church. And he could be killed for keeping the Sabbath, for example, and that he must have got rid of all the pre-4th century copies. By the look, there were hundreds from the 4th century. So I believe the Aramaic is much more accurate. And there's lots of little things that crop up when you compare the Aramaic translation into English with what we're used to in all the English versions are from the Greek in the 4th century. So I guess my question to you is, how open do you think people like yourself are to facing up to the Aramaic, whether you're prepared to concede that it might be a far better place to start, and that there are some good scholars who've translated into English from there? And apparently it's been around from about 1905 when they first started having contact with the churches way out there, when European powers sort of got into that far into the Middle East. But it was ignored for 100 years or so, really. It's only in the last 25, 30 years that more scholars have put a lot more time into it and got it fine-tuned. So, but the tendency has been for most academic people who are not directly involved to ignore all the Aramaic aspects of it. Do you think that's true today?
I'm interested to see how you're going to handle it.
There are plenty of Greek texts that predate the 4th century. And there are, while the reference to Matthew having been in an Aramaic version.
It was Hebrew, isn't it? He says.
No,
It says Hebrew, but it means Aramaic.
yeah.
No, there are.
But anyway, but
Matthew's only,
yeah.
Hebrew.
So there's a reference in Papyrus or something to that.
Yeah.
And so that generates a debate. I'm not aware that they've certainly got any texts in which there is an Aramaic or Hebrew Matthew. But I do know that Joseph Fitzmyer, who's a recently, last 10 years deceased New Testament scholar of some significance, opted for a Aramaic background to the Gospels, trying to find, because Jesus would most likely have been Aramaic speaker, although Judea would have been Greek speaking because of the Roman influence and stuff for the couple of hundred years. So I do know that there have been attempts to backward translate from the Greek to the Aramaic to see if there are ways of understanding some of the Greek expressions. Do they reflect an Aramaic idiom? So I guess I would say, as far as I know, people are willing to engage and explore the idea, but it's not won any general acceptance in terms of being a wide, that there's evidence out there that's being ignored. In terms of scholarship, the idea of being able to overturn the standard position is what lots of young PhDs want to do. So there's nothing in New Testament scholarship that actually eliminates somebody putting forward new ideas and it being tested. And there are Aramaic. So the question is engaged with. But I think that I'm totally unaware of any evidence that would suggest that there was a deliberate attempt by the church to stamp out its Jewishness. My particular area of interest is the separation of the church and the synagogue in 1st century Rome, the parting of the ways between the Christians and Judaism. When did they develop separate religions and stuff like that? And I don't think that the church of the 1st century were anti-Semitic, and I'm not sure that the Roman Empire was anti-Semitic in the way that we understand anti-Semitism. The Romans were against everybody that wasn't Roman. They were outliers, from the edge of the empire. So yes, there are bad things said about Jews in Roman texts, but there's bad things, Cretans I mean, we think of Cretans as idiots.
In one of Paul's letters.
Yeah, and so stereotyping is a fairly common practice.
They even do it with Scots, don't they?
Yes, I mean, people assume that Scots are great people, generous, and stuff, and that's a stereotype. It's not true for everyone. But I guess I would say that in New Testament studies, this is such a high level, I mean, the UK, Europe, North America, Australia, but I mean not in the same way. I mean there's hundreds of these people studying this stuff, and there's no way to kind of create a conspiracy that stops it. It might be the case where if you said something that was unorthodox, you would lose your job at a seminary, but you would get a job at a university. I mean, there's nothing. The universities have got departments of religion and stuff. So this stuff is happening. The debate is on. So it's unlikely that there's a big piece of the puzzle that is just being ignored for idealistic. Ideological, that's the word I wrote, thank you. Ideological reasons, because they would be challenged. And yeah, I mean, people like Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, who is used his position as a New Testament scholar to, what's it called? Sacred cows or whatever. I mean, Bart just likes to look for a sacred cow so he can slaughter it. And he was the president of the Biblical Society. And so just because you go out slaughtering sacred cows doesn't stop you from being at the centre of biblical studies. So if there's a case to be made, somebody could make it, and they would be able to put the case forward and challenge and stuff like that. So I certainly agree that Aramaic because Aramaic is the first century language of Jesus, it's likely to be in there. But one of the Maranatha Abba, but Maranatha, our God come, or come Lord. One of the things that upsets form criticism was the idea that somehow there's a Jewish church and a Gentile church and a Jewish diaspora church and stuff like that. They have this whole system. But Maranatha is an Aramaic term that you get in Paul's letter written to Corinthians, who would have only spoken Greek. The fact that the church held on to some of the Aramaic language indicates that there was a kind of positive sense to the continuity between Jesus and the early church. They weren't trying to break that. They were trying, where they could, they were trying to use it. So yes to Aramaic being important, but I don't think and yes, Constantine isn't a great person, but Constantine's influence over, Constantine's no pope, and the history of the 4th century, it's got lots of different pockets. Athens, Alexandria, Antioch, Antioch, all these days, were different centres of learning and took different approaches to things. And while some got ascendancy, others would revert. And so it was a very engaged thing. And Constantine's role he called the synod, but his role is reasonably minor.
Nobody was in charge.
Yes, nobody was in charge. And yes, there is a rise of anti-Semitism in the 4th century. The church was partly responsible for that. When it went from being a persecuted minority to being an official supported thing, and often people then use the newfound power to take out their frustrations on others. So the 4th century is not a good period for the church. Neither was the 20th century.
What interests me is like when they come up and they decide what books were going in and what books were going out of the Bible. And if you were caught with books out of the Bible, you were actually persecuted. You were, these were taken from you.
Almost the other way around.
You don't think they were promoted?
No, almost the other way around. One of the things that encouraged the establishment of the books of the Bible was the question of what would you die to keep? And they were happy to give up books that went canonical because you go ahead, burn them. But they would die for the Matthew and Luke and stuff.
I thought if people got caught with doctrine, you actually had your titles or your lands taken. You actually...
No, there's not that kind.
There was, this was not what I'm saying, the books, right? So if you got caught with these 50-odd books which were included, there was no persecution. It was okay to continue on with your belief outside of the condoned understanding. There was no persecution. What you're saying, there's no persecution. So if I had the book of Mary Magdalene, if I got caught with that book, or the book of there
Judas,
was no persecution.
No, nobody. So the times of persecution were related to the church. So there was a 256. Later, I think 290s. In the early 300s, before Constantine, there were some heightened periods of persecution. But those times were persecution of mainstream. The Roman Empire was a very polytheistic culture.
Yeah.
So there was nothing wrong with being anything. What was wrong with was being Christian if Christian meant that you weren't going to give your allegiance to the emperor or the gods. And so the persecution was directed towards those that we would call Catholic Christians, the main church, the great church, rather than to the ones on the edges. The church was in a position to persecute its heretics. The canon was being developed, and the first list of the canon of the New Testament, 27 books and only 27 books, is in 367. And so there wasn't, there were lists of books that were profitable, there were lists of books that were not profitable for reading, but there was no church way of enforcing that. So
e.g. the Book of Enoch, if you got caught with the Book of Enoch, which is the grandfather of Noah.
Are you talking about the place, Constantine?
The 4th century or the...
I can possibly believe it post-Constantine.
But even then, society, the Roman Empire, Roman law was based not so much on there's a law that you have to obey, because there's no police force. It's not that kind of law. What is personal complaint. So you have to bring a complaint against your neighbour. The Roman magistrates wouldn't rule on religious disputes. What they ruled on was whether or not the person was willing to acknowledge the emperor. And so Christians weren't persecuted for being Christian or for believing Christian things. They were persecuted because they wouldn't sacrifice to the emperor. They wouldn't acknowledge the gods. So there's no law, there's certainly no law in Roman law that prohibits the reading of certain things. In the Roman Empire, around the time of Jesus, there were certain groups that were outlawed, but they were outlawed in terms of gathering in Rome because they were seen as potentially seditious. A group of people meeting together could be a threat to the power. But they weren't. The issue wasn't over the theology or what they were reading. It was whether or not a group that was meeting in secret was a danger to the empire. So it doesn't translate well from our kind of law-based culture with police force and or the secret police or stuff looking for people who had ideas. It doesn't translate into the first, second, third century in that kind of way. Yes,
We better call it.
we could obviously keep talking about this forever, but my wife